the slide, Pranab?
So we'll start with it now. I think we're live on YouTube also. Perfect.
But I can't see it in YouTube.
It just happened. It just happened. We just started it. All right. So a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for the talk. And I'll not take much time. For those of you not familiar with Anveshan, Anveshan is a forum of researchers, academicians, journalists, and activists who share a commitment to the idea that human society needs to and can undergo a progressive social transformation that will eliminate all forms of oppression and exploitation. So we've been active for many years, and in the past we've organized panel discussions, talks, and conferences on a range of social, political, and economic issues. And of late, we've been very active online, and we've organized a series of talks and discussions on COVID and other pressing issues, which can be accessed on our YouTube channel. If you want to know more about Anveshan and how to be a member of it, please feel free to write to us. I'll share the email ID in the chat box. And we have two speakers with us today, and I'll just hand it over to the moderator for the day, Professor Satyaki Roy. Satyaki Roy, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Pranab. And thanks to Anveshan for giving me the honor to moderate this August panel, which includes the two most eminent economists of our country, Dr. Pronab Sen and Professor R. Nagaraj. We are here to discuss today about the recent release that the government of India has made about the Q1 GDP estimates, where we see a severe contraction in the economy in the range of about 24%. The private final consumption expenditure has contracted by around 27%, and investment has contracted by about minus 47% contraction, which means it has almost halved. And it also has its impact in the economy because people are losing their income. A lot of unemployment and job loss happened because of this. Now, it is also important to note that, of course, many other countries are facing the same mega health challenge or the pandemic, but the contraction that happened in India is highest among the G20 countries. But we are here to listen from, as I said, the two most eminent economists of our country, Dr. Pronab Sen, who was the former Chief Statistician of India and currently the country director of International Growth Center. Every time when some new estimates come or some new policy is being announced by the government, we see Dr. Pronab Sen in the headlines of all main newspapers where he shares his views and opinions. So we'll be looking forward to hear from him about this contraction and the way forward. Welcome you, sir. And then we also have, as you know, Professor Nagaraj, who was professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, Mumbai, and currently is visiting also CDS Thiruvananthapuram. And any serious student of Indian economy must have read Professor Nagaraj's work on Indian growth trajectory in general, and particularly on the manufacturing sector, estimates of manufacturing GDP, performances of public sector, and so on. So we are really privileged today to listen from these two economists about the current conjuncture, and also not only the contraction and its different dimension, but also we would like to hear from them about the way forward. So I request all the participants I welcome them and also request them to put across their questions after the first presentation, so that we can take up some of them at the end of the discussion. And I request also to the speakers to restrict their presentation within, say, 20-25 minutes, so that we can have some discussion at the end of the presentations. And both the speakers would know that how difficult it is for me to tell you to stop. So please, please enforce that restriction of time upon yourselves. and help me to moderate the discussion. Without further ado, I would request Professor Nagaraj to share his views first.
Yeah.
Sir.
Thank you. I will start my presentation. I'll share my screen. Can you see the screen, please?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Satyaki, for the kind invitation. I'm happy to be here. Hello to Pronab. We have been on several such meetings together on GDP. Yeah. So this is about the recent GDP estimates and the state of the economy. Yeah. This is the actual data. For India, it is 23.9 or 24%. This is a data for comparable countries. One can see that India is the worst among all the countries listed here. One can add more countries, but I think this is fairly good representation. So one can see that India has performed worst among these set of countries. Actually, this number is a comparison over the same quarter last year. Okay. So this is because initially there was some dispute in the media about what this 23%, 9% means. I would say it's over the same quarter last year. Now I'll show you. This is the next graph. This is from the tweet of the IMF chief economist Geeta Gopinath. Here you see that India's GDP contraction is slightly more than 25.6%. This is because it is quarter over quarter. This is comparison of April-June growth rate vis-a-vis the previous, that is January-March this year. So both roughly give the same picture. So I think the growth contraction is one of the worst in the world, which we have to admit. There can be no two opinions about that. So this is the purpose of these two graphs. Okay. But the reliability, the estimates are questionable. A poor reliability due to very little primary data for estimation. This is important point. See, I usually do not comment on the quarterly GDP estimates for the simple reason that very little primary data goes into estimation of quarterly GDP in India, unlike in other countries. Most of this is projections and rates and proportions of the annual GDP. So one should not read too much into it. But I think the broad direction of it is pretty clear. So therefore, I just look at the headline number. I did not go into look at the consumption, capital formation, which Satyaki talked about. I think, this tends to see a broad picture. But very importantly, it does not adequately capture informal sector data. Because most of the informal sector estimates we have is for the annuals, and they are basically point estimates. So therefore, this doesn't capture fully, and that's the reason probably the growth rate could have contracted even more than what is reported here. My personal estimate before the numbers came was between 25 and 35%. And this was slightly lower than my lower estimate. I think Pranab had something 30+%, his estimate. I think he was probably closer. But the point is that the numbers could be far worse than what the official numbers show. Yeah, that's the bottom line of this slide. Now, from this, people have projected the forecast for the entire year, and these are just sample numbers actually. Yeah, same thing. These are sample numbers. ADB projects -9%, Goldman Sachs -14.4, Moody's. All of them are double-digit negative. That's important. Okay. Correspondingly, the employment would have contracted. which is expected. CMI shows a massive job loss in the organized sector, some 14% or something. I don't know how. I mean, I think the broad direction is right, but CMI estimates people question. So I take that to be roughly correct. If that is the magnitude of job losses in the organized sector, one can expect a multiple of that for the unorganized. I mean, that's the seriousness. And unorganized sector, as we all know, has no. I mean, they don't get paid for the day they don't work. That's it. So therefore, they have no security whatsoever. So the situation is very grim, far grimmer than what the official numbers show. I mean, that's a simple point. Okay. What's important is that unlike earlier, see, we had the 2008-9 financial crisis, where also there is a negative growth rate. Okay, but that came at the peak of a boom. I mean, in 2007-8, India grew at 9% plus. Okay, so a fall from that level is different from when already economy was in a very bad shape. That's important. So we have, we know, in fact, many of you would know that there has been a serious slowdown of the economy since around the middle of the last decade, from 2014-15 or so. Yeah, the official GDP growth rate for 1920 is 4.2. It could be an overestimate by 1 to 2% if the disputed GDP estimates are valid. Many of you probably know there's a big dispute for the last 4 or 5 years about the extent of overestimation of GDP. Some people say it's between 1 to 2%. Admitting that there's some validity to it, the last year's growth rate could be 4.2% minus 1 to 2%. Annual GDP growth rate has decelerated since around the mid-2010s, though the precise numbers are muddied because of the GDP estimates problem. Okay, and we also know that corresponding to this, there's a fall in employment, rise in unemployment rate, fall in per capita personal consumption, especially in the urban areas, and rise in absolute poverty between 2011, 12, and 17, 18. These are all well-known figures in academic circles. Yeah, I have written about it, and many others have also commented on it. So the economy was in a pretty bad shape. So the lockdown and the pandemic comes as a salt to the injury. Therefore, we are in a far worse situation than we have been there any time in the post-independence period. So that is the gravity of the problem, which we need to realize. Fine. So policy response of the government has been right. Yeah, in May, government announced the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, brief package of about 10% of GDP. It mostly consists of loans and guarantees of various kinds if people take loans. Okay. Additional government expenditure has been in the rate is about 1% of GDP roughly. Okay. So India has been very conservative on this. This is very important to keep in mind. Unlike the advanced countries, or even what IMF and even some of the bond rating agencies have suggested, India has been far more conservative than what they have suggested. Even IMF has said India probably can do more fiscal. So what is the reason? I can't understand, but what is certain is that India has been extremely conservative. Some of the government spokespersons said that India cannot have larger fiscal expenditure because we are a poor country. But we have found that even Vietnam has about 3.5% of GDP as additional fiscal spending. I have some numbers from Bangladesh. I'm not sure of the number, but even that number is higher than for India. So there's something very seriously different about India with respect to the response to the crisis. Okay, so therefore, if this is the response, then the GDP contraction which I noticed is quite understandable. Okay, so result is very clear that we have the worst contraction. Okay. Actually, here is a graph. This is taken from the IMF's June report, which shows that this is the and you see two lines here. The red line is the additional spending and foregone revenue, and blue line is the additional loans, equity, and guarantees. You find India has one of the lowest in the world. The only two countries lower than India is Mexico and Turkey. Okay, so this is the extent of it shows the relative comparative picture. India has done far worse than most other countries. Yeah. Okay. So, after unlockdown, what has happened is a significant recovery of lost output, which has happened, but not a V-shaped recovery as the government has claimed. There is Reserve Bank governor last week said the recovery is, however, not yet fully entrenched. Moreover, in some sectors, uptick in June and July appear to be leveling off. By all indications, the recovery is likely to be gradual. I think this coming from RBI governor a few days ago is very significant. Inflation remains high and a cause for concern. And I think particularly macroeconomists who comment on this have been very concerned about it. I personally not too bothered because it's mostly disruptions. There's no significant supply constraints, but basically disruptions which is causing. So I think one should not. I would not put problem of inflation as important as loss of jobs and livelihoods. It is not due to supply constraints, but to disruptions after lockdown. Localized restrictions have hurt movement of men and material. Okay? Migrant workers are returning slowly to urban areas because the pandemic has spread to smaller cities. In Bombay or in Maharashtra, I can say it has come down in Bombay city, but it has spread to the industrial towns of outside of Bombay, like Pune, Sholapur, Bhiwandi. So therefore, this is where most of the workers go for work today. And there, the local lockdowns have hurt resumption of production. There is abundant liquidity in the market, but no takers. See, but this is not a supply constraint. That's important. There's no shortage of supply of capital, labor, or credit. But I think problem is of the demand. What should be done now? I think need for a substantial spending, public spending to speed up recovery. Respond to the spread of the pandemic to smaller towns and villages. My impression is, I have not followed the health part of it very much, but outside of the big cities, the health facilities are in extremely bad shape. And I think states are not in a position to respond to it adequately at all. So that's something which needs to be done. Okay. And as I said earlier, even the IMF and credit rating agencies have said India probably should spend more. This is the second bullet point I have. I think this is my personal idea, which I'm trying to put forward. I think we require a health emergency plan or a public health revolution of the kind the advanced countries experienced about 100 years ago. You know, that if you recall, if you read the history or historical novels, you'll find that how dirty the Western big cities were. If you think of say Paris or London, they were extremely filthy. Okay, but there was a huge public health revolution by the end of 19th century, early 20th century, which led to huge improvements in health outcomes. And I think the pandemic is a wake-up call for India, and I think we should have a massive health revolution plan, which I don't think anybody has been talking about. I've been trying to raise my voice about it, though I don't know enough about public health expenditure, but it can be done. Okay. The last point is something which basically, if you have to get back to 7 to 8% growth rate, okay, which is what we call the sustainable growth rate to have effect on poverty, unemployment, then I think there is no option but to revive public infrastructure investment. I think investment is in a bad shape. We all know. Okay. See, this is one point I would like to add. Most of the decline in growth rate which has happened during the second half of the last decade is been mainly on account of decline in capital formation, that is fixed investment. Okay, and that needs to be revived. Decline in investment is decline in consumption is moderate, but real increase has to happen only in investment demand. Okay, that's it. Export demand, I know there's a lot of talk about it, but export demand is unlikely to pick up. because we know that the world economy is in a bad shape. Even the latest IMF forecast for the next 5 years says that it will be quite some time before it recovers, world economy recovers. So I would bet on domestic-led growth, domestic demand-led growth, and investment-led growth. Okay. Conclusions. India's economic contraction of lockdown is worst among major countries and emerging market economies, much worse than initially anticipated. Probably reflects the tepid policy response. India has been extremely conservative. Recovery is on but muted. Looks it will take 21-22 to get back to GDP level of 1920. So 2 years of complete collapse of the economy. India needs a public health revolution of the kind advanced countries witnessed over a century ago to fight infectious disease. To recover growth, India needs a massive investment plan. Government alone can undertake, as the private sector is mired in debt and commercial banks in mounting NPAs. I stop here. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you. Satyaki, I hope I've been within the time limit.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for your views. And so what we get from the first presentation is that the slowdown that is happening in India at the moment was there even before the pandemic. It only aggravated because of the pandemic. And Professor Nagaraj has basically argued that the government could have done more. It has much more fiscal space, but it was conservative in its policies. And we need to develop our public health expenditure and to gear up our investment to fight this contraction. Now, I have one thing to share also, that you can see that around 100 participants have already is there in this Zoom platform. For this discussion, we had asked for registration. Around 450 people have registered for this discussion. So many of them would be following this discussion in our YouTube channel, Anveshan's YouTube channel. So they would be putting across their questions. So Dr. Surajit Das and Pronab would join me after this discussion to pick up some of those questions from different platforms so that we can discuss with the speakers after the second presentation. Now, may I invite Dr. Pronab Sen to share his views. Sir. Sir, please unmute.
I am unmuted. Thank you, Satyaki. It's a pleasure to be here. And as usual, it's a pleasure to be with Nagaraj on the same platform. But there's been a rather peculiar reversal of roles, which is normally between the two of us, I'm the optimist and Nagaraj has been the pessimist. In this particular instance, I'm afraid I think Nagaraj has been on the optimistic side. And let me try and motivate some of it, perhaps give you a few contrary numbers. By the way, before I go on to the main presentation, there was a question that was asked right in the beginning by Anindo, who said that as per, Nagaraj had said that the quarter-on-quarter contraction was 25% as per the IMF. And Anindo makes the point that as per the CSO, it turns out to be about 29%. And Anindo is right. So where is the discrepancy? And the answer is that whereas the CSO number is expressed in real 2011-12 rupees, the IMF number is constant dollars. So there's an exchange rate element that's playing out in that difference. I mean, and it's quite sizable. I mean, if we're talking about roughly 4%. So let's get that out of the way. Let's keep IMF for international comparisons. That's all very well, but it doesn't help us very much in terms of where we are and where we'll be going very shortly. All right. As I said, by and large, I totally agree with Nagaraj, except I will highlight the places where I am in slight disagreement. Firstly, let's take the issue of the job losses. The job losses in the organized sector, we know, and Nagaraj, I think, very rightly pointed out that the job loss in the unorganized and the informal sector may be actually much, much higher. Now, the problem, of course, is this is by and large true of the smaller units, what we call the micro units. But the informal sector can surprise you. In fact, it has already started to surprise us, because the numbers that are coming out is that the job losses in the formal sector and the reported job losses in the smaller MSME sectors are actually getting made up by the informal sector. And that's no surprise, because the informal sector is the employer of last resort. So even if I lose my job, I will end up doing something even if I'm earning very little, but technically I will be shown as employed. Now, this has already started showing up. And the rural data is suggesting pretty much that if you go by the CMIE numbers. So the point is that the headline unemployment rate may not look that bad. And by headline, I'm talking about the usual principal status number. It may not look that bad, but what it will hide is the quality of the work that is being done and the incomes that are being generated from that work. Because people would be moving from much higher productivity forms of employment to vastly lower productivity work. So I think we should be very careful about looking at the headline employment data as we go forward, because it can be misleading. And we should be looking at it in a much more nuanced way in terms of the sectoral breakdown of where the people are being employed. So that's a word of caution. The second is on the issue of inflation. So again, ever since the RBI moved to using the consumer price index as its target inflation, our entire focus has shifted to the CPI. And in the CPI, we are seeing over 6%, nearly 7% inflation happening. But what we are losing sight of is that there is another index, which is the wholesale price index, which has shown negative growth for 4 consecutive quarters and has just crawled into the positive zone at plus 0.6% last month. So the WPI is actually indicating that insofar as the producers are concerned, they are not facing inflation. They're facing the opposite. They're facing deflation. Now, if there is a feeling that builds up in the minds of producers and potential future investors that deflation or very low inflation rates for producers is going to be an abiding feature of the Indian economy for some time now, then you would be looking at extraordinarily high real interest rate, which would be discouraging investors. So today you have a lot of people talking about how the effective interest rate, which is the interest rate minus inflation, is at an all-time low, because the interest rate on 10-year government securities is sub 7%, and the inflation rate is at about 7%. So in effect, we are by that measure, we are in a zero interest rate regime. But if you take that 7% and juxtapose it with minus 1% that is happening in the WPI, you're really looking at an 8% real interest rate, which is very high by our standards. Okay, so it is no surprise that investors are wary. And by the way, this isn't all that new. You know, Nagaraj, I think, very rightly pointed out that when COVID hit us, we were already on a downward trajectory as far as the growth rate is concerned. Now, if you look at the period between 2017-18 and this year, what you will find is that the inflationary story becomes interesting. That is, inflation measured both by the CPI and the WPI have been steadily coming down. Now, because of that, we've had reductions in the interest rate, but the reductions in the interest rate now I'm talking about the past tense, hadn't really kept pace with the reduction in inflation. So the real interest rate didn't move very significantly one way or the other. So the story of inflation is an important one, and we need to be very careful what we are talking about. The interesting point that comes out of Nagaraj's presentation is that if on one hand the consumers are facing very high inflation, what is it doing to consumer sentiments? Will it persuade? There is an argument that is always made that if the CPI inflation is high, people try to front load their consumption, which means savings go down in the economy. That's been the traditional argument in economics. Question, is that true? Is consumer sentiment changing in a manner where people are trying to front load? And the answer clearly is no, they are not. And the reason they are not lies in the lockdown experience. Because during the lockdown, what had happened is that other than a very small fraction of our population whose wages and salaries were fixed and did not get affected, everybody else saw either their incomes vanishing or getting cut quite drastically. So even among the middle class, parts of the upper middle class as well, there have been a fair amount of salary cuts. 30 to 40% salary cuts has been common across India. Now, in a situation of that kind, a lot of people, in order to maintain their lifestyles, and the poor in particular, who for whom it was an issue of survival, would have brought down their savings dramatically during the COVID period, during the lockdown period. At some point, they're going to start building it up again. They're going to be holding their consumption down till such time as their savings reaches prudential levels. How long this can last, we don't know, because it's directly related to the progress of the disease. The longer the disease stays, the greater will be the levels of uncertainty among consumers, and the higher will be the tendency to save. On the other hand, if you look at the WPI, and investors are not willing to invest, and I think for good reason, what you're going to be getting is a situation where, as the overall demand contracts, because both consumers and investors are holding back on their expenditures, you're going to start seeing a lot more deaths happening in industry. Companies which may have survived till now will start closing down, because remember, all the bank moratorium and all of that is gone as of 1st September. So what you will find is a lot of companies who survived until now because of the moratorium will be unable to service their debt. The banks will have to do NPA recognition, even though that is being held off for a while. But they will be NPAs. They will not get further bank finance at all. Now, how much that damage can be is anybody's guess. But if that damage is substantial enough, then we face a genuine problem, which is that supposing the government does do exactly what Nagaraj has been advocating, which I've been advocating, which I think the entire economics community in India has been advocating, which is please go in for public investment in a big way, that may end up being infructuous because the supply side may be damaged sufficiently to not respond to the demand impetus that public investment may give. That is a real danger, which is why it is, I think, important where the government acts now before the damage becomes too large. And the window is going to close very, very quickly because all the moratorium is out. And if you look at the banking data on the kind of loan sort of the bank loans which are being rolled over, they are only about a quarter of the total bank loans. It's not a large part. A very large part of it, there are no negotiations. The bankers are unwilling to go into negotiations. And the net result is most of these borrowers will be unable to service their bank loans and will become NPAs on the books of the banks and will not be eligible for further bank credit. That's a huge problem that we are looking at, and we should be very, very clear about it. Let me finally touch upon, I think, an extremely important point that Nagaraj made, which was the focus on public health. As far as public health is concerned, I think we all agree that as a country, we have underinvested in public health ever since the beginning. Other than a short spurt in the 50s and very early 60s, we have systematically underinvested in public health, and it has been getting worse over the years. So Nagaraj quoted 1.3%, is actually even a little lower than that. And it has been trending, this as a percentage of GDP, our public health expenditure has been trending downwards for decades. So what we are talking about is not an emergency. Nagaraj, this is where I disagree. This is not an emergency public health plan. I think our entire attitude towards public health must change. I mean, it should become a political hot potato. The people in the political system must feel that unless we focus on public health, we are going to lose the trust of the people and thereby lose votes. It has to go to a level of a movement rather than an emergency measure. Emergency measure, you may well be surprised at the end of the year, once the full data comes out, given the amount of money that the states are spending on public health, you may actually find public health expenditures going up from your 1.3 to somewhere close to 2. But that's not going to be sustained. Once things clear up, we may well go back to our bad old ways. And so we need to really make a movement out of this, saying that we need to have a steady increase in public health expenditures from the current 1.18% to something. Nagaraj talked about 2.6. I would say it should be closer to 3.5. That's the kind of care you need, expenditure you need, if you are going to be able to tackle the problem of epidemic proportions in rural India. Our systems are okay to provide more or less a certain amount in the urban space. In rural India, we have no reach. And unless we actually almost triple the public health budget, we will not have that reach. And another incident of this kind, and we'll be in deep trouble again. I'll stop here and then go for questions. I'm sorry if I overran the time, Satyaki.
No, sir. What I get from your presentation, I think that the contraction, as you said, that can be even more severe because of the uncertainty that is there. And if the government is not able to intervene on the demand side the way people have argued, then there would be a deeper damage in the supply side. And that is going to create a problem. So I would like to hear from you even more about this, that is it going, are you indicating that it may lead to a kind of a protracted crisis and a stagflation, which happened in other parts of the world during the 70s, whether we are moving to that kind of a crisis where the inflation and the stagnation goes on together. But before going to those, I would also some of the questions have already been put forward by the participants. So I will raise some of these questions which are there in Zoom platform, and then I would request Dr. Surojit Das to put those questions what are there in the YouTube. Now, first is one question is that the government debt has also increased to an unprecedented level. So how you can increase expenditure in order to resolve the demand problem? So shall I, 2-3 questions I will put together so that the speakers can choose what they want to respond to. The second important question that came here is that whether what would be the nature of the recovery, whether it would be a V-shaped recovery or a K-shaped recovery. This is already in the discussion in public discourse, so if you can comment on that. The third question is that there is a kind of disconnect between the behavior of the stock market and the real economy. So the stock market is still climbing and the real economy is facing a kind of a contraction. So how you reconcile these two? So let's begin with these 3 questions. To begin with, we can have another round of questions again. So I'd request again on the same order, shall we go?
Yeah.
So shall I request Professor Nagaraj to respond to in 3 of these or any of these?
Yeah, thank you, Satyaki. I know that public debt question is good. You can hear me, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Public debt question will come up. See, the world over, public debt has gone up. I mean, this is a pandemic. Okay, so for everywhere in the world, almost every country I can think of, okay, they have gone ahead and increased debt. Therefore, I think we should not bother about that. At this stage, secondly, the debt is domestic debt. We are not in a macroeconomic crisis situation. We are in a situation where we are in economic sort of a depression. There is no demand. Okay, and most of the demand which is there and which can be created, which is what we are suggesting, is mostly domestic demand, which can be created, which can be met mostly by domestic resources, and we have excess capacities in most of the industries. So therefore, the fear of inflation. I mean, I will talk about Pronab's thing later, but I think the debt issue at the moment should not be considered. I mean, I would say just take the American economy. American economy. I was following the latest Bureau of Commerce website. There, see, American debt has gone up over 110%. I can give you the reference if you want, those who are interested. Look at there's a blog set called Conversable Economist. Who is run by the editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. He has a blog post last week. Okay, you can go and check. He has given the actual data. You can see that the debt of American economy has gone up. And by the way, most over 60% of it is borrowed from the Fed, not from the market. So it is basically old-fashioned debt, what we call deficit financing, which America is doing right now, given the problem. So world over, this is a norm today. So I think we should not worry about it. That's my person. Okay. About the K shape and V shape, I agree. I agree. I mean, V shape we have discussed. Probably still we are not yet back to the. But K shape, I can see it in education. In fact, I think today my guess is 90% of the students are not in school, are not able to get educated. Whereas the top 10% in the elite schools in Bombay and Delhi are sitting in front of the their laptops. Okay, so this is a clear case of a K-shape. Okay, or our engineering students and doctor students, they're all able to write their NEET exam or whatever exam, whereas the bulk of others can't do anything. They are lost the year. Okay, so therefore it is a K-shape, especially with respect to education. Other things I don't know, but this is definitely true for education. The third point was about. Sorry, could you just repeat that one?
So the third was the stock market and the real economy.
Yes. This is third. You see, you must understand there is abundance of liquidity in the global economy. Okay, I mean we know that, and therefore, the global funds flow wherever they get the best rate of return adjusted for risk. And India's interest rates vis-a-vis the rest of the world is much higher. So they're too happy to play with the money here and get returns for doing nothing. I mean, I'm putting it very simply, but that still holds. Okay, so that would be my first reaction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, Dr. Pronab Sen.
Yeah, okay. No, I agree.
Sir, 1 minute, sir. I would add one thing, one dimension regarding the first question.
Okay.
What is added is that if deficit financing continues, then there would be an additional burden to the people in the form of tax in the future. So you can also incorporate to the question regarding this deficit and debt part.
Yes, that is correct. Any debt build-up ultimately is a tax on future generations. That's the implication of any debt build-up. The issue is that, yes, if we build up our debt, we will be leaving a legacy for the future, a negative legacy. They'll have to finance this much larger public burden. But ask the question on the other side. Supposing we don't do deficit finance, then what is the legacy we are leaving them? What we will be leaving them then is a huge deficit in public infrastructure, possibly a huge deficit in private production capacities. So you're doing a trade-off. It's not that just because there's public debt, that's an unmitigated minus. It depends upon what that public debt is leading to. Now, if that public debt, like Nagaraj and I have been talking about, is leading to more investment and therefore greater capacities present for the future, that is the legacy also that you have to take into account. And you have to ask the question that net, is it positive or negative? So this is an important issue. But let me give you the other point of view, which is that supposing we do not, the government does not have an expansionary fiscal policy, that is a huge fiscal stimulus, right? Then it is almost certain that the economy will continue to contract. So you forget about the V-shaped or K-shaped recovery. What you would be looking at is an extended U, maybe even an L. All right? Now, in which case, if the economy is going to be performing well below its capacity, your tax collections are going to be correspondingly low as well. So even if you keep government expenditures at exactly where they were last year, you'd still be building up debt. And you may be building up debt for a much longer period, not the 1 or 1.5 years that Nagaraj and I are talking about, where you're doing a fiscal stimulus and getting the economy back on track. What you're then talking about may be looking at 3-4 years of sub capacity performance, and over 3-4 years, continuously increasing debt stock. Now, these are things that need to be worked out. These have to be done numerically, and then to check which is it that you prefer. But in humanitarian terms, the Nagaraj option is way to be preferred, because you're preventing the current generation from suffering unnecessarily. The future generation is going to suffer one way or the other. But if you do not have a fiscal stimulus now, then the current generation will be suffering much more. Okay. The second, so we are on the nature of the recovery, and I say, the nature of the recovery is going to be determined, and I think this is the point Nagaraj is also making, by the nature of the government response. So if the government sits on its hand and does nothing, please look at a U-shaped recovery. I think Nagaraj has factored in some amount of fiscal stimulus in his estimate that by the end of 21-22, we may be back to the 1920 level. My calculation suggests that if the government continues at the expenditure level budgeted for the current year, that is as per the budget estimates, we are not going to get back to the 1920 GDP level before 23-24, and to the per capita 1920 level before 24-25. We are looking at much longer time frames if the government sits on its hands. Finally, on the stock market, why are you surprised? Why is anybody surprised? Do you remember what happened after demonetization? The informal sector got completely wiped out. The massive job losses that happened. Stock market boomed. And why did it boom? Along with the explanation that Nagaraj gave, which is a massive amount of liquidity floating around, it is that everybody expects corporate India to gain market share at the expense of the SMEs. They're looking a whole lot better in terms of their ability to capture the market. So yes, I mean, it's not entirely irrational exuberance.
So, Surajit, would you?
Yes, Satyaki. Yes. In YouTube, there are 3 questions. One is related to education expenditure. How much should be the expenditure on education, and whether this new education policy would help in reviving the economy. The second question is about if government is skeptical about increasing fiscal deficit, then at least why don't they cut the interest rate in this current situation? And there is another question that why is the contraction, GDP contraction, highest here in India? Is it because of the more stringent lockdown, or there is some other reason? So along with that, there is another question in the chat box, which I think Satyaki has missed. I think somebody was arguing that government should probably give more money to the poorer section of population for reviving the demand. So what is your comment about that? And I would like to add 2 or 3 questions. Can I add right now, Satyaki, or should I ask later?
Please.
Yeah, sir, I have 2-3 questions in my mind. One is, since it is understandable that the employment situation is likely to be very bad in the near future, and even right now it is very bad. So until and unless the employment situation becomes normal in the country, many people are arguing that there should be universalization of MG NREGS program with enhanced wage rates. So what is your comment on that? Secondly, the RBI is sitting on 20% of GDP amount of idle assets, that is foreign exchange reserve, right now, $542 billion as on 4th September 2020. So can part of this money be utilized by the government to finance the fiscal stimulus or whatever, instead of showing desperation in selling off all the public sector units, which the government is doing to get some liquidity for spending, financing the public expenditure. The third thing which I had in mind is about the front loading of government spending right now to give the economy a big push or a fiscal stimulus. I mean, after 2008 financial crisis, all over the world, we have witnessed some kind of concerted fiscal stimulus. Degree may vary country to country, but this time, even after this unprecedented negative shock world over, we are not hearing from some countries, some news are coming that there are some stimulus package, etc. But that kind of fiscal stimulus, concerted fiscal stimulus or effort is not visible as of now. So why do you think that this time there is not such a discussion even after this bigger negative shock world over? Thank you, Satyaki, for the opportunity.
Okay. So, sir, I request again Professor Nagaraj to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Satyaki, but it is a long list. I mean, I've really understood. Okay, sorry, I think I'll take up this Suraj's question because I immediately remember them. Okay.
Yeah.
See, NREGA making it kind of a universal. I think it's a welcome idea at this moment. In fact, there is a proposal for equivalent urban NREGA. In fact, I think John Trace has a policy piece which is in public domain, which is being discussed. I have not looked at the details, but I think that's a very good proposal. No, I'm not looking at the details, but overall the idea is very good, and I would think that should be tied with the public health revolution I was talking about. Because put it this way, public health broadly involves creating physical infrastructure. You require concrete, okay? You require sewerage, drainage, drinking water, okay? You don't require any foreign exchange for it, okay? And this can be done with simple labor, okay? Using domestic material, okay? That can be done. I hope there's a greater discussion on John Race's proposal. I think I welcome that. Secondly, about front loading of fiscal stimulus. See, I agree. In the immediate 1 year or 2 years, there has to be public spending on supporting consumption. I mean, to get back to where we were in 2000, let's say 1920. Okay, that's the immediate as a humanitarian crisis, the employment crisis. But after that, what? After that, we require public investment of the kind I discussed about. Okay, so therefore, I'm agreeing with the okay. Right. Sorry if I. Surajit, could you just come again in your questions? I'll try to answer. Surajit.
Sir, the 20% of GDP amount of foreign exchange reserves.
Okay. Right. Put it this way. I mean, see, one thing. Let's see. This is something which I think very often it is missed. This is a debt for us. This is not our earnings. See, unlike China, our foreign exchange reserves are a debt, mostly because they are basically made up by short-term capital inflows. They are not like export surplus like in China. Okay, therefore, spending that has to be done carefully. But we don't require that. See, we don't require foreign exchange today to create stimulus. We require domestic resources, and domestic resources can be by government can borrow from the capital market or go in for deficit financing. Okay. And your other question was, why is there not been enough like in 2008-9? Why is there not been adequate response? I would say, in fact, there has been an enormous response. In fact, if you look at again, I would just say, please go to IMF World Economic Report, the World Economic Report, June update. In fact, you see the graph I presented. It is from that source. Okay, and you go and see, or the OECD has come up with a report just last week. on they all show there's been a huge increase in government expenditure. Okay, of course, that time there is a fear, and I think there's the G20 countries got together. There is a concerted effort, but this time I think most countries have done that. I won't be able to offhand compare how this compares with that, but if I just go by the US expenditure, US today has done so much more, unlike Canada. See, in fact, I have some knowledge about Canadian. See, today any Canadian citizen can, if he's unemployed, he will straightaway get $2,000 per month transferred to his account, no questions asked until the economy recovers. Therefore, the advanced countries' economies are supported by this level of government expenditure. So therefore, I think there has been a lot of it, which is probably not. I think it can be figured out. How does it compare with the earlier? I do not know. About the earlier questions, I think about somebody asked about education. I think today, education expenditure, I mean, the new economic policy, sorry, I don't think I've not thought about it. Okay. See, our public, I think government expenditure of 3.5 to 3.6% of GDP on education is probably all right. I would say it should go up to 6, I agree. But bigger problem is the new economic policies seem to be more bothered about the higher education, technical education, rather than universalizing the literacy or primary education, or even the RTE. I think my impression is that the discussion on those are far less. So therefore, I think in that sense, NEP seems lopsided in my view. Okay, the concern is for the middle class and the upper middle class, not about the poor people's education. I have missed other questions. If somebody can prompt me, I'll probably respond, or I'll leave it at this stage. Satyaki, you take a call. I think take it subject to your time. Satyaki? Hello?
Yes, sir.
You want
so, Surajit, would you like to repeat one or two which have been...
Yes, sir. There was one question related to making transfer payment to the poorer section of population for boosting
more or less he has commented.
I commented.
Yeah. And there was another question that if government is skeptical about fiscal deficit, why can't they at least reduce the interest rate in the current situation?
See, today I think we have interest rates have been reduced, but in spite of it, there is no pickup. So the problem is not lack of credit or its interest rate. The problem is from the demand side. Okay, so I think therefore it is not a supply problem; it is a demand problem in the aggregate. Okay, so I think interest rate. I mean, there are no takers for loan even at very low interest rates. So I don't think that's a problem. The problem is from the demand side. That's it. That's my.
Okay, sir. Sir, I have, there are two very specific questions related to this estimation. So apart from the questions that Professor Nagaraj has answered, if you want to add on that, of course you would be doing, but I would add 2-3 more questions, which are very specific. One is a data question, which says that by this time, a data question, please, the quarterly GDP estimated on the basis of proxies of organized sector usually leads to some estimation error. But this time, the subsector public administration, defense, and other services shows a dip of -10%, despite government expenditure rising by 10%. So he's asking an explanation about that. The second very interesting question, which is that hypothetically, if we assume, okay, where it is. Hypothetically, if we assume that Indian economy was not in a state of slowdown before the advent of COVID, what would have been different according to you in terms of government responses to the pandemic? And also what would have been different in terms of the final outcome of GDP? in the sense that if the slowdown was not there, then where would have we landed up because of this pandemic? So if you would like to respond to these two questions apart from the earlier ones.
This is for whom?
Sir, for you.
Oh, for me. I thought you were asking Nagaraj a couple of extra questions.
No.
Okay, so let me begin with the questions at the end on the data. All right. The quarterly data in any case is on very, very limited data set. There is some data on agriculture. There is some data that is received on GST. But the bulk of the data really of the estimates come from the performance of the listed companies. Not just all companies, this is just listed companies. So these are the larger corporates who are listed on stock exchange. These are publicly limited companies. So the assumption is that these companies would, their growth, their change, would in some sense reflect the changes happening in those sectors in the economy at large. So that's a problem to begin with when there is enough external evidence to suggest that the corporate sector and the non-corporate sector could be behaving very differently because they're facing different shocks. This time around, the problem is a little more acute because SEBI gave an extension to the listed companies for submission of their quarterly returns. So the returns which should have come in July actually will be coming in at the end of September. And as a result, these estimates, the minus 24% estimate that you are seeing, is done on the basis of only those companies which have already filed their returns, which is a subset of the full set. Now, how the full set will change that prognosis is difficult to tell. But the likelihood is that the companies who have already filed their returns are the larger and the better organized, even of the listed companies. So what could come out once the full data is in could actually be worse than what has been seen. Okay, the second question is utterly fantastic. I mean, I love the question that, we've been harping upon what would have happened had India not been on a slowdown prior to COVID happening. I think nothing else would have dramatically changed. There'd be a difference in the levels from which we start, but the impact would be roughly the same because the impact is the impact of the lockdown. The real difference is going to come in the recovery process. Because what the slowdown was suggesting, and I think quite convincingly, that investor confidence was low and getting lower. Now, with a shock of this kind, reviving investment, turning those sentiments around is going to be much more difficult than if investors were gung-ho, ready to go, then COVID hit. Mentally, they would still be gung-ho. So, but unfortunately, now that's not the case. The investor community was down and out to begin with, and this would have just made matters so much worse. So it's not so much, would the GDP have looked better? The answer is no, because that is really completely a function of the nature and intensity of the lockdown. The recovery process would be very different. Okay, let me go back to some of the questions that had come earlier. In particular, Nagaraj answered most of them. The question that I think was not answered is that if the government is not able to give a fiscal stimulus, why doesn't it cut the interest rate further? Well, it could. But, the fact of the matter is ultimately government cutting the policy rate doesn't make any difference What really matters is what is the rate that is being charged by the banks and other financial institutions from their borrowers. That's what really makes a difference. Now, what people keep forgetting is that the bank lending rate has two components. Everybody seems to think it's only one component. Well, three components. People think there are two. The first component is the risk-free interest rate, which is essentially the interest rate on government bonds, which is the one you are talking about. The second is the cost that the bank bears. That is the cost of intermediation between the saver and the borrower. The third, and this is the most important, which people forget about, is a risk premium, because the banks are bearing risk. They are guaranteeing the deposit rate to their depositors, but they are taking the risk of default on the side of those to whom they have lent. So for that, because of that risk, a risk premium is charged, and this risk premium is a direct function of the level of uncertainty in any economic system. So if because of COVID, because of the government response, levels of uncertainty go up, the banks are perfectly justified in charging higher risk premium because their risks have risen. Now, no amount of cutting the interest rate on government, on the repo rate, basically, which is the policy rate, is going to change that. The only thing that will change it is if the uncertainty becomes less, which is why both Nagaraj and I have been talking about confidence building, that you have to boost confidence, you have to boost sentiments. Because until and unless that happens, the level of risk aversion is going to keep increasing in the banking sector. And as a result, you will not get a decline in the interest rate that is charged to borrowers. And then I think pretty much everything else.
Sir, would you like to respond to Surajit's question? I also want to hear from you that why don't we see a coordinated global effort regarding the stimulus package, the kind of response we saw during the 2008-9 crisis?
Because for the very simple reason, there is no need for coordination at this time. You know, the global financial crisis had two characteristics. Okay, I'm sure you are aware of this. The first characteristic was because the financial system was much more interlinked globally than the real economies. When you had a crisis which originated in the financial sector, it would have repercussions on a much larger number of countries. And those countries would be unable to address those issues by themselves because of this high degree of interconnectedness. Whereas this time around, the problems are local. COVID may be a global phenomenon, but the impact that has been happening are localized. And so each country is addressing it on two sides. One is how much economic damage are you willing to consider in order to contain the disease? So that intensity and the duration of the lockdown, that's one decision. And the second decision is, having taken that decision, how much are you willing to do to put the economy back? For this, you don't need global coordination necessarily. Global coordination may come later because a lot of countries, India is not in that category, a lot of countries are going to get indebted. And they're going to get, their levels of foreign indebtedness is going to go up. Now, the second reason, and this unfortunately is going to sound as if I'm making an ideological point, is that in the global financial crisis, who got hurt? They were the largest companies. They were the multinationals. This time, who's getting hurt? The informal sector. So who in the global economy really cares a hoot about what is happening to the Indian informal sector or the Nigerian informal sector, or for that matter, their own informal sector? Okay? Everything ultimately depends upon who can influence the levers of power. During the global financial crisis, it was the large companies, the multinationals, and the global investment banks. This time around, it's basically the MSMEs and the informal sector.
Okay. So, Surajit, and I think that we can take another round questions because we should also have to close. It is already 7:20. This should be the last round. You can add.
So should I mention there are 2-3 more questions which have come in YouTube?
In this Zoom group, I would mention 2 questions which are related. One is how we can help the exporters in this period of pandemic, because there is a global slowdown, how the exporters can be helped. The second question is that what about if we pursue this import substitution, banning Chinese products and all this, would it help to grow our production, and whether India can join the global value chain by this process of substitution? So these are some of the questions in this Zoom group. And now, Surajit, I would request you to put some.
Yes, there are 3 questions in YouTube. One is about the Asha and Anganwadi workers. They are not being adequately supported by the government, and they are the frontline workers in this situation of pandemic. So what are your comments on that? Second is how much this Atmanirbhar Bharat package would be effective in solving the problem, because I mean, out of 10.3% of GDP amount of Atmanirbhar Bharat package, only 1.3% is expenditure enhancement, and more than 75% of it is potential infusion of liquidity and some I mean, collateral free with government guarantee loan enhancement. And the third question is about this vicious circle that if there is a lower growth, lower employment, lower income, and lower profit, then obviously there would be more revenue shortfall and larger fiscal deficit.
Yep.
And along with that, there is another vicious circle, which I would like to add that, as Professor Sen was talking about this confidence building, and business confidence also, that until and unless market expands or demand expands in the market, investors would not make an expansion, and until and unless that happens, employment situation would not revive and the growth would not pick up. So in the fiscal side, there is one vicious circle. In the real economy, there is another vicious circle. What is the policy way out, or what is the kind of solution to get rid of these 2 vicious circles?
So may I request Professor Nagaraj to respond first? You may like to choose some of these. Sir? Is he there? Sir, you may choose to respond to some of these.
Yeah, but I think, go ahead, you were asking something particularly?
No, so did you follow the questions? One was...
Yeah, I did. I was listening to it.
Okay.
Yeah. You see, exports and import substitution. Exports, see, if you look at the aggregate, export situation is very bad. To expect that we can really boost export at this moment, I think it is too much to expect. Okay, we must just try to keep our whatever markets we have, intact. That should be the immediate task. I understand from the news reports that the government has withdrawn some incentives. Government has been, as I said, been very keen to conserve its fiscal resources. So they have withdrawn some incentives, and the export houses have been asking for it. I don't know the details. Maybe there is a scope for restoring them if it is genuine. Okay. import substitution, I think this is related to the Chinese threat. I think the increase in imports from China has been significant. I think Bishwajit Dhar's working paper, shows. In fact, yesterday there is a Exim Bank issued a working paper which has far more details about this. I think that is so. Therefore, I think so. It's not just the total quantum of imports from China, but I think the critical sectors we are becoming vulnerable. Like I think the bulk plants. Okay. So therefore, I think there is or even fertilizers. So I think there's a need for careful import substitution policy. Idea is not to shut the Chinese imports immediately and cause disruptions. See, after all, import substitution policy has to work over a period of time. In some kind, and it has to be. It cannot be simply. It cannot be simply import restriction with tariffs and subsidies. We must require a clear industry-specific plans for expanding domestic production, and if you want foreign companies to come and invest in those industries, you require to provide infrastructure, which we are lacking acutely. So unless there is a clear strategic plan to expand domestic production of critical imports, we will not succeed in that. Okay. So I see very little signs of that happening. So therefore, my feeling is nothing much is happening on the ground with respect to responding to Chinese imports, Chinese threat. Okay. I'll talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat package. I think Atmanirbhar Bharat package honestly will do very little at this stage. We have discussed about it. My impression is, maybe I'm cynical. I think the Atmanirbhar package essentially says, government says, you be on your own. Don't depend on the state. So I think fiscal conservatism of the government, I think, seemed to reflect its ideological leanings very clearly. So I think Atmanirbhar package, Atmanirbharta, as we understood, was about a national Atmanirbhar. But here I think the government seems to be talking about individual self-reliance. Don't depend on us, don't depend on the government, you take care of yourself. Okay, I think that's a fiscal conservatism. So I think I stop here. I think I'll leave.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sir, Dr. Pronab Sen.
Okay. Yeah, as far as exports and import substitution, I completely agree with what Nagaraj said. With only just one addition, which is that if things continue as they are, take it from me, the rest of the world is going to actually start growing before we do. So your exports may actually go up. Not because you've done something right, but because everybody else is doing better than you, and their markets look more attractive. So be careful what you wish for. The question on Ashas and Anganwadi workers is really important. The fact of the matter is that the Ashas and Anganwadi workers are a part of the ICDS system, where the entire cost of these wages are picked up by the center. The states pick up the cost of the local facilities, whereas the center picks up the wage costs. Now, if the center is adamant about not increasing its fiscal outlay, then this is not going to increase. And I think it should increase, and it should increase dramatically. In fact, if I might suggest, given the situation today, an increase, maybe make it a one-time increase, maybe for a one-year period, double their allowances. It's very similar to doing a direct income transfer, like you're doing into Jan Dhan accounts. It's very similar to that in terms of effect. But its outcome in terms of healthcare and control of COVID will be dramatically higher. And this is, to my mind, a fairly low-hanging fruit. Government is still considering direct transfers into Jan Dhan accounts. This may actually give you much bigger bang for the buck. On the consumption side, it will be no different, but in terms of healthcare, it would improve things immeasurably. So I completely, whoever asked the question, I think has asked a great question. And I think it should be a part of the fiscal strategy of the central government. But then that runs into the problem if the center is not willing to spend. Okay, let me make a little correction to what Nagaraj said. Nagaraj talked about how the Atmanirbhar Bharat in terms of the fiscal stimulus is very low, and he talks about 1.3% of GDP. But if you look at the recent demand for grants, supplementary demand for grants that was placed before Parliament and just gotten approved, the amount demanded is 1.3% of GDP, but the government is giving up about 67,000 crores. So the net fiscal impetus over and above what was budgeted is only 0.8% of GDP. Okay? So in terms of the fiscal stimulus, it's virtually non-existent. Let's be very clear about it. The part of Atmanirbhar Bharat which has been effective was not of the government's doing anyway, it was the doing of RBI, which was essentially giving the moratorium, deferring the recognition of NPAs, and so on. That's allowed a lot of companies to survive. Though all of that has gotten taken into Atmanirbhar Bharat. What is left, and this is the critical one, is this 3 lakh crore package for the MSMEs, which is supposed to be fully guaranteed by government. Now, this is an important initiative. It's in fact a critical initiative for revival of the economy. Right? The point is that as of now, the uptake from this facility hasn't been that great. And so from what I hear from the bankers, only about half of it has been sanctioned and only about a third has been disbursed. The bankers are saying that there is still not a demand. Now, if that is the case, then what it is saying is that, and I'm now not talking about investment, I'm talking about people who had shut down their plants and need this money to restart their plants. Not a new investment. They don't have the confidence that if they start production, there will be a buyer at the end of the pipeline. So they see lack of demand as being a major stumbling block in the restarting production. Because I had thought that this money would just vanish overnight. You know, people would be scrambling to take it. The bankers are saying, no, it's not happening. So that's, I think, an important thing which we need to look out for. Let me finally get to the vicious cycles. Look, vicious cycles can only be corrected by an agency which can stand outside of that circle, who is not endogenous to the cycle. An endogenous entity cannot break a vicious cycle. Now, if the government has gone into a mode of thinking that it is endogenous, because my taxes are falling, therefore I have to cut expenditures, then we're in trouble. Because the government is the only exogenous agent in both the cycles you mentioned. Not just the fiscal. The fiscal is the obvious one. That's the one which is causing us all the problem. They are critical to the second. Right? But if you treat the government as being endogenous to the process, then we are clear.
Satyaki, there is one more question. Should I or
Please.
uh,
So one more, and this is the final question. Okay.
come
So
yet in
not
that is the
extend
angle of fiscal. Yeah, that is the angle of fiscal federalism. Somebody has asked that 15th Finance Commission has recommended that this health should be shifted from state list to the concurrent list. And for all practical purposes, we know that most of the social sector expenditure responsibilities are lying with the state governments rather than the union government. So what is your take about that? Whether how to make states more equipped so that they can spend more money on the social sector if required in the current situation? So if you can comment on that.
Sir, Professor Nagaraj, would you like to make some comment on this?
Yeah, we all know the situation that, you know, the government has not even paid what was supposed to be paid to them, or I mean, not paid with what was supposed to be shared with them, not paid. It's not a, it was the GST, and the central government asked them to go and borrow from the market with conditions. I think I think there is no fiscal federalism. It's like a, you know, it's like a, I mean, situation looks like more like a money lender rather than a kind of cooperative federalism. So I think that attitude is completely wrong. I think the notion, and government only believes in giving guidelines and what the state should do, rather than saying, look, if you give guidelines, there is also a responsibility to say how it's going to be financed. The government has never been talking about it. So I think it's the discussion has been completely one-sided. So I think we are in a very sad situation with respect to the center-state relations, the financial relations. So I think I think that sums up.
Okay, sir. Sir,
Can I just comment on this?
please.
You know, as far as this business, I didn't know that the 15th Finance Commission has been talking about shifting health from the state list to the concurrent list. But I think that's a bad idea. I understand the motivation, but the right way of doing it is that if the Finance Commission can make a carve out for defense, the Finance Commission can also do a carve out for health and say that from the central resources, X amount will be carved out for health and distributed to the states who are in charge of health. Rather than say, I'm going to shift it to the concurrent list and therefore make it the central government's responsibility. I think that's a bad idea. And it weakens federalism.
Okay. So I would thank the participants. I would thank the speakers for sparing their valuable time for this discussion. It was really, I think all of us would agree that it was a wonderful discussion. We got a lot of insights from the speakers who are real authority on this area. And we thank you, sir, for participating in this discussion and enlightening us on these issues.
Goodbye, everybody.
Okay, goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you. Surajit.
The people are still there, Shatagida.
Pranab, do you have any idea that how many people were there in the YouTube?
Yeah, so at the max we touched 70 people.